Starving 8-year-old girl stood trembling in the rain-soaked streets, watching the royal procession pass by like a golden dream she could never touch. Her mother had locked her inside their room 3 days ago, whispered, "Forgive me," through tears, and vanished into the storm. Now, with hunger clawing at her insides and nowhere left to turn, Alara made a decision that would shatter a kingdom's darkest secrets. She stepped forward, barefoot and desperate, and spoke words that would change everything. "Your Majesty, can I spend just 1 day with you?" The king froze. His face went pale as death. Because this child, this impossible child standing before him, had eyes he recognized. Eyes that shouldn't exist. Eyes that proved a 15-year-old lie was about to destroy everyone he'd ever loved. What Alara didn't know was that her single question had just signed 3 death warrants. Her own. Her mother's hiding somewhere in the shadows with blood on her hands. And the queen's, a woman who had already murdered once to keep this secret buried. The castle walls were about to run red with the truth, and only one thing was certain. By the time the sun rose again, nothing would ever be the same. But the real question wasn't whether Alara would survive her 1 day in the castle. It was whether anyone would survive the revelation of who she really was. The child's fingernails were black with dirt, and her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps that fogged the frigid morning air. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had already buried hope 6 feet deep. The royal procession moved through the cobblestone streets of Thornhaven like a gilded serpent, all polished armor and crimson banners, while she stood pressed against the cold stone wall of the baker's shop, trembling. Not from the cold, from the decision she was about to make. A decision that would either save her life or end it in the dungeons beneath the castle. Her mother's final words still burned in her ears like hot coals. "Forgive me, Alara. Forgive me for what I've done, for what I must do now." Then the door had slammed, the bolt had scraped into place from the outside, and her mother's footsteps had faded into the storm. That was 3 days ago. Alara's stomach twisted with a hunger so vicious it felt like her insides were eating themselves. The baker had chased her away twice already, and the fishmonger's wife had thrown a bucket of rancid water at her when she'd begged near the docks. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The rain from last night had soaked through her thin wool dress, and now it clung to her small frame like a second skin made of ice. She could feel her own heartbeat in her temples, fast and panicked, like a trapped bird beating its wings against cage bars. The royal guards were getting closer now. She could hear the heavy rhythm of their boots, the jingle of sword belts, the occasional bark of command. And somewhere in the center of that moving fortress of power was him. King Edmund the Steadfast, the man every merchant praised, the ruler every peasant feared, the widower every woman in the kingdom pitied. Her fingers dug into the rough stone behind her. What if he laughed at her? What if he ordered her whipped for daring to speak to royalty? What if he simply looked through her, the way every other adult had done since her mother vanished? But then another thought, sharper than hunger, more painful than cold. What if this is your only chance? The procession was 20 paces away now. 15. 10. Ilara's legs felt like they were filled with sand, but she pushed off the wall anyway. Her bare feet slapped against the wet stones as she stumbled forward, and immediately 2 guards turned toward her, hands flying to sword hilts. "Back, child!" one of them barked, his face hidden behind a steel helmet that reflected her own terrified expression back at her. "The king does." "Not. Please!" The word ripped from her throat with such desperate force that it didn't even sound like her own voice. It sounded like something dying. "Please, Your Majesty. My mama left me. She locked the door and she left, and I don't know what to do. I'm so hungry. I'm so cold. I just need—" Her voice cracked, splintered into 1,000 pieces. Tears burned hot tracks down her filthy cheeks. And she hated herself for crying, hated that she was weak, hated that she was small and helpless and alone. But most of all, she hated the look in the guard's eyes. Pity mixed with contempt. Poor little rat. Poor little gutter child. The procession had stopped. Completely stopped. The horses snorted and stamped, their breath creating small clouds in the morning air. And then, through the wall of armored bodies, he appeared. King Edmund the Steadfast was 42 years old, with silver threading through dark hair that was tied back in a simple leather cord. His face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines, the face of a man who had made impossible decisions and lived with their consequences. He wore no crown during these processions, only a simple dark cloak over well-made but unadorned clothing. But there was something in the way he carried himself, something in the set of his shoulders and the directness of his gaze, that made it impossible to mistake him for anything other than what he was, absolute authority wrapped in flesh. His eyes found Alara, and she watched something flicker across his features, something that looked almost like pain. He studied her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 heartbeats, 6, 7. His jaw worked, as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "What is your name, child?" His voice was deep, rough, like gravel rolling down a hillside. Not unkind, but not warm either. Careful, controlled. "Alara, Your Majesty." She forced herself to look at him, even though every instinct screamed to look at the ground, to make herself small, to disappear. "Alara." He repeated it slowly, as if testing the weight of it. His eyes narrowed slightly, and she saw his hands tighten into fists at his sides. "And your mother? She locked you inside your home and left?" "Yes, Your Majesty." She was crying. She kept saying she was sorry, that she had to protect me, but I don't understand what from. And then she was gone, and I broke the window to get out because I was so hungry and I didn't know what else to do. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for bothering you. I just thought maybe you could. The words tumbled out in a chaotic rush, each one tripping over the next. "Maybe I could." "What, Alara?" There was something new in his voice now, something that made the guards exchange glances, something that sounded dangerously close to tenderness. No, that couldn't be right. Kings didn't feel tenderness for gutter children. "Maybe you could let me stay with you, just for one day, just so I'm not alone, just so I can." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "Just so I can remember what it feels like to not be scared. My mama, she used to say that kings have big castles and warm fires, and nobody goes hungry in a castle. I don't need much, Your Majesty. Just one day. Please. Can I please spend just one day with you?" The silence that followed was so complete that Alara could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. The Adan King's face had gone pale, bone white, as if she'd struck him. His eyes were locked on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she couldn't. She was trapped in that gaze like a moth pinned to parchment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it shook. Actually shook. "One day." He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, it was stronger, harder, the voice of command. "One day, then. You'll come to the castle. You'll be fed. You'll be warm. And then..." He stopped, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. "And then we'll see." Before Alara could respond, before she could even process what was happening, the king turned sharply to his captain of the guard. "Prepare a carriage. The child rides with us." "Your Majesty," the captain began, concern etched into every line of his weathered face. "Perhaps it would be wise to..." "Now, Captain." The word cracked like a whip. The captain bowed stiffly and moved to obey. And Alara stood there, still trembling, still cold, still hungry, but now with something new unfurling in her chest. Something fragile and dangerous. Something that felt horribly, terrifyingly close to hope. King Edmund looked down at her one more time, and this time she saw it clearly, the pain in his eyes, the recognition, as if he were looking at a ghost. "Come, child," he said quietly, extending one gloved hand toward her. "Let's get you out of this cold." But as Alara reached for his hand, she didn't see the figure watching from the shadows of a narrow alley 3 buildings away. Didn't see the way the woman's face twisted with something between rage and fear. Didn't see the glint of desperate calculation in eyes that had once been soft with mother's love. The woman watched the child climb into the royal carriage, watched the procession begin to move again, and then she turned, pulling her hood low over her face, and disappeared into the maze of streets like smoke, dissolving in wind. Behind her, pressed into her belt beneath her cloak, a kitchen knife was still stained with blood that hadn't quite dried. The castle was nothing like Alara had imagined. In her dreams, castles were warm places filled with laughter and the smell of honey cakes, where kind servants smiled and soft music drifted through halls decorated with flowers. The reality was cold stone that swallowed sound, corridors so long they seemed to have no end, and a silence so thick it pressed against her eardrums like wool. The servants who passed didn't smile. They stared. Their eyes followed her mud-caked dress, her tangled hair, her bare feet, leaving dirty prints on floors so polished she could see her own reflection. She wanted to apologize for existing, for dirtying their perfect castle, for breathing their clean air. But her throat was too tight, her tongue too heavy. King Edmund walked ahead of her, his boots clicking against the stone with mechanical precision. He hadn't spoken since they'd entered through the massive oak doors, hadn't looked back to see if she was keeping up. His shoulders were rigid, his spine straight as a sword blade. Every few steps his hand would rise toward his face as if to rub his eyes, then drop back to his side as if he'd remembered himself, as if showing weakness was not permitted, even in his own castle. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever, Alara's legs burning with each step. Her stomach growled so loudly in the echoing space that she saw the king's shoulders tense, but still he said nothing. Finally, they reached a corridor lined with portraits. Dead people staring down from gilded frames, their painted eyes following her movement. Alara's gaze caught on one portrait in particular. A young woman with golden hair and eyes the color of summer sky, wearing a crown of white roses. The woman was smiling, but there was something sad about that smile, as if she knew something terrible that no one else could see. "My daughter." The king's voice made Alara jump. He had stopped walking and was standing perfectly still, staring up at the portrait with an expression that made Alara's chest hurt. Princess Helena. She would have been 15 this winter. Would have been. The past tense hit Alara like a fist. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, anything. But what do you say to a king who has lost his child? "I'm sorry." Felt too small, too useless. So she said nothing, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge made of grief. The king finally tore his gaze away from the portrait and continued walking, but now his steps were heavier, as if each one cost him something. They stopped at a door carved with roses, and he pushed it open with one hand. The room beyond stole Alara's breath. It was a child's chamber, but not like any room Alara had ever seen. A bed large enough for 3 people dominated one wall, covered in blankets so soft they looked like clouds. Shelves, lined with books, more books than Alara had known existed in the entire world. A wardrobe with doors slightly ajar, revealing dresses in every color imaginable. Dolls sitting in a row on a window seat, their painted faces frozen in permanent smiles. And everywhere, a layer of dust, as if no one had entered this room in a very long time, as if it had been sealed away like a tomb. This was Helena's room, the king said, and his voice was so quiet Alara had to strain to hear it. "You'll stay here for your one day." He still wouldn't look at her, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. "The servants will bring you food, clean clothes, whatever you need, just for today." Alara took a tentative step into the room, her bare feet sinking into a rug so thick it felt like walking on moss. The contrast between this and the locked room her mother had left her in was so vast it didn't feel real. None of this felt real. "Your Majesty," she whispered, Why are you being so kind to me?" Now he did look at her, and the expression on his face made something crack open in Alara's chest. It was the look of a man staring at something that hurt him, but that he couldn't look away from. "Because," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him, "you remind me of someone I failed." Before Alara could ask what he meant, a sharp knock at the door made them both turn. A woman entered without waiting for permission, and Alara knew immediately that this was someone important. She wore a gown of deep purple velvet, her dark hair braided and coiled like a crown, her face beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful. Dangerous. Her eyes swept over Alara with the efficiency of a hawk spotting prey, and her mouth tightened into a thin line. "Edmund," the woman said, and there was ice in her voice despite the apparent civility of her tone. "What is this?" "Queen Isabella," the king replied, and Alara noticed how his entire body had shifted, become defensive as if preparing for battle. "This is Alara. She will be our guest. For today." "A guest?" Isabella's laugh was like breaking glass. "A street child covered in filth is a guest in my castle, in my daughter's room." There was so much venom in those words that Alara took an involuntary step backward. "Helena's room has been empty for 3 months, Isabella. 3 months of dust and silence and you think to replace her with this?" Isabella gestured at Alara as if she were something rotting. "This creature who probably has lice and disease and who knows what else? Have you lost your mind entirely?" "Careful." The king's voice dropped to a register so low it was almost a growl. "Remember to whom you speak." "I speak to a man who has forgotten his duty," Isabella shot back, taking 3 quick steps into the room. She was tall, nearly as tall as the king, and she used that height now like a weapon. "I speak to a man who parades his grief through the streets and makes spectacles of his weakness. The nobles are already whispering, Edmund. They say you're unstable, that you see Helena's ghost in every child you pass. And now this. What will they say when they learn you've brought some beggar into the castle and dressed her in—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as they fixed on something. Alara followed her gaze and realized the queen was staring at her left wrist, at the small birthmark just below her palm. A crescent moon shape, faded and small, but distinct. The color drained from Isabella's face so completely that for a moment she looked like one of the portraits in the hallway. Dead and painted. "Where did you get that mark?" Isabella's voice was barely a whisper now, but somehow that was more frightening than her earlier anger. Alara looked down at her wrist, confused. I was born with it, Your Majesty. My mama always said it meant I was watched over by—" "Get out!" Isabella's hand shot out, finger pointing at the door with such violence that Alara flinched. "Get out of this castle, now, before I have the guards throw you out." "Isabella, that's enough." King Edmund moved between them, his hand raised as if to physically block the queen. "The child stays. I have given my word." "Your word," Isabella repeated, and now her voice was shaking. "Your word will destroy everything. Everything we've built, everything we've protected. You don't understand what you've done, what you've invited into our home." She turned on her heel and strode toward the door, but paused at the threshold. When she looked back, her eyes found Alara's, and the hatred there was so pure, so concentrated, that Alara felt it like a physical blow. "One day," Isabella said softly, "you have one day, little girl. I suggest you make peace with whatever god you pray to, because tomorrow, when the sun rises, I will personally ensure you leave this castle. And trust me when I say—" She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Alara had ever seen. "I always keep my promises." The door slammed with a sound like a coffin closing. The king stood frozen, his hand still raised, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Finally, he lowered his arm and turned to Alara. Whatever he saw in her face made his own expression soften slightly. "Don't be afraid," he said, but the words rang hollow. "Isabella is protective, but she won't hurt you. Not while you're under my protection." Alara wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel safe, but as She looked down at the crescent moon mark on her wrist, the same mark that had made the queen look like she'd seen a demon crawl from hell. One thought echoed through her mind with crystal clarity. One day might be all she had left to live. The bathwater was still warm, but Alara couldn't stop shaking. A servant woman named Martha had scrubbed her skin until it turned pink, muttering under her breath about poor lamb and skin and bones, while working expensive soap through Alara's matted hair. Now Alara sat wrapped in a towel so soft it felt like sin, staring at her reflection in a polished silver mirror. She barely recognized herself. Clean skin, hair that shone dark brown instead of mud-colored. The bruises on her arms from where she'd broken through the window stood out now, purple and yellow against pale flesh. But it was the birthmark on her wrist that held her attention, the crescent moon that had made the queen look like death itself. Martha returned carrying a dress of simple blue wool, far plainer than the elaborate gowns hanging in Princess Helena's wardrobe, but still finer than anything Alara had ever touched. "Arms up, child," Martha said, her voice gruff but not unkind. As she helped Alara into the dress, her weathered fingers paused on Alara's wrist. "That's an unusual mark," she said carefully, too carefully. "My grandmother had the sight. She did. Said marks like that mean you're special. Chosen." "Chosen for what?" Alara whispered. Martha's eyes met. Hers in the mirror, and something flickered there. Fear, warning. That depends on who's doing the choosing, doesn't it? Before Alara could ask what she meant, Martha pulled the dress down with a brisk tug and began lacing up the back. "Now listen to me, girl. You seem like a good child, so I'll give you advice my own daughter never lived long enough to hear. In castles, walls have ears and portraits have eyes. You watch your step, you watch your tongue, and most of all," she leaned close, her breath warm against Alara's ear, "you watch the queen." A knock at the door made them both jump. Martha's hand stilled on the laces, and Alara felt the woman's fingers tremble slightly before she called out, "Enter." The door opened to reveal a man Alara hadn't seen before. He was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in the dark robes of a scholar or advisor, with silver spectacles perched on a thin nose and eyes that seemed to calculate and measure everything they touched. When those eyes found Alara, they widened almost imperceptibly, and his hand rose to grip the doorframe as if he needed support. "Lord Chancellor Dominic," Martha said, dropping into a curtsy so quick it was almost insulting. "We weren't expecting—" "Leave us," Dominic said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. "The king has requested I speak with the child alone." Martha hesitated, her fingers tightening on Alara's shoulder in what might have been protection or warning. Then, she released her grip, curtsied again, and left without another word. The door closed with a soft click that sounded to Alara like a trap snapping shut. Lord Dominic moved into the room with slow, measured steps, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. He circled her once, twice, as if she were a horse he was considering purchasing. The scrutiny made her skin crawl, made her want to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. "Tell me, child," he finally said, stopping directly in front of her. "Where exactly did you say you were from?" "I didn't say, my lord, but I lived in the lower quarter, near the fish market." "And your mother's name?" "Mira, my lord." "Mira." He repeated it slowly, rolling it around in his mouth like a wine taster checking for poison. "And your father?" "Dead, my lord. He was a soldier. He died when I was very small. I don't remember him." This was true, but also not quite true. Alara had fragments of memory, pieces that didn't quite fit together. A man's laugh. Strong hands lifting her high. The smell of leather and steel. But nothing solid. Nothing real. "A soldier," Dominic murmured, and something in his tone made alarm bells ring in Alara's head. "And did your mother ever speak of his service? Where he served? Under whose command?" "No, my lord. She didn't like to talk about him. It made her sad." This was also true. Whenever Alara had asked about her father, her mother's face would close up like shutters slamming over a window. and she'd find some task that desperately needed doing. Eventually, Ilara had stopped asking. Dominic's thin lips pressed together in what might have been satisfaction or concern. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small object wrapped in black cloth. When he unfolded the fabric, Ilara saw it was a miniature portrait, the kind nobles carried of their loved ones. The painting showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with golden hair and blue eyes. She was beautiful, but there was something fragile about her beauty, as if she were made of glass that might shatter at any moment. "Do you recognize this woman?" Dominic asked, watching Ilara's face with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. Ilara studied the portrait carefully. There was something familiar about the woman's face, something that tugged at the edges of her memory, but she couldn't place it. "No, my lord, I don't think so." "Who is she?" For the first time, Dominic smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Ilara's stomach turn. "That child is Princess Helena, painted on her 14th birthday, 1 year before she died." Ilara looked at the portrait again, her heart beginning to hammer. The woman in the painting looked nothing like the portrait in the hallway, the one with the sad smile and crown of roses. That Helena had been older, harder, more real. This Helena looked like a doll, perfect and empty. "I don't understand, my lord. Why are you showing me this?" "Because," Dominic said softly, folding the cloth back over the portrait with careful precision, "you need to understand something very important. Princess Helena died 3 months ago in a riding accident. Her horse threw her and she struck her head on a rock. It was very sudden, very tragic, and very convenient." The word hung in the air like poison gas. Ilara took an involuntary step backward. "What do you mean, convenient?" "I mean," Dominic said, moving closer until Ilara could smell the parchment and ink that clung to his robes, that Princess Helena had recently discovered something that would have destroyed several very powerful people. Something about her own birth and the birth of another child, born around the same time, to a woman of common blood. Ilara's wrist throbbed where the birthmark lay. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." "Don't you?" Dominic tilted his head, studying her like she was a particularly interesting insect. "Let me ask you something else, child. Has anyone ever told you that you have your father's eyes?" The question was so unexpected that Ilara answered without thinking. "My mother used to say that. She'd look at me sometimes and get this strange expression, like I reminded her of something painful." "Your father's eyes," Dominic repeated. "Dark brown, almost black, quite distinctive. Do you know who else has eyes that color?" He paused, letting the question hang. "King Edmund, and every member of the royal bloodline for the past 6 generations. It's a dominant trait, very strong, very unmistakable." The room seemed to tilt. Ilara's hand shot out to grip the back of a chair, her knuckles white. "That's impossible. My father was a soldier, a common soldier. My mother said—" "Your mother said many things, I'm sure, but consider this." Dominic's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 15 years ago, before King Edmund married Queen Isabella, he had a brief encounter with a young woman from the lower quarter. A woman who worked in the castle kitchens. A woman who became pregnant and was paid a substantial sum to disappear and never speak of it again. That woman's name was Seren. She married a soldier shortly after, a good man who agreed to raise the child as his own. That soldier's name was Marcus. And the child... He let the sentence trail off, but Ilara heard the ending as clearly as if he'd shouted it. "The child was my mother." "No," Ilara breathed, but even as she said it, pieces were clicking into place with horrible precision. Her mother's strange reactions when they'd pass the castle, the way she'd clutch Ilara close whenever royal guards appeared, the nightmares where she'd wake screaming about things taken and lies told. "You're lying." "Am I?" Dominic pulled out another object, this time a folded piece of parchment yellowed with age. "This is a record of payment, made 15 years ago to one Seren of Thornhaven. 500 gold crowns. a fortune for a kitchen maid. The payment was authorized by Lady Isabella, then the king's betrothed, and witnessed by myself. I keep very thorough records, you see. I always have. Ilara's vision blurred. If what he was saying was true, then her mother was the king's daughter, which meant Ilara was... She couldn't even finish the thought. It was too big, too impossible. "Why are you telling me this?" she managed to ask. "Because," Dominic said, carefully folding the parchment and returning it to his robes, "you need to understand the danger you're in. Queen Isabella has spent 15 years making sure Seren stayed silent, and now you've appeared with your father's eyes and that mark on your wrist, the same mark King Edmund carries on his shoulder, the same mark every royal child is born with. You're not just some street orphan the king took pity on, child. You're proof of a secret that could unravel everything." A sound in the corridor made them both freeze. Footsteps, getting closer. Dominic moved to the door with surprising speed. "Remember what I've told you," he said urgently. "Trust no one, not the king, not the queen, not even the servants, and whatever you do..." He paused with his hand on the door handle. "Don't let anyone see that mark again. Cover it. Hide it. Because the moment Queen Isabella confirms what she suspects, your one day in this castle will become your last day alive." He slipped through the door just as it opened wider to admit a servant carrying a tray of food. The girl smiled at Ilara, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Your supper, miss. The king requests your presence in the Great Hall in 1 hour." She set the tray down and left, and Ilara was alone. She looked down at her wrist, at the crescent moon that had suddenly become a death sentence. Then she looked at the food, elaborate dishes that smelled of herbs and butter and things she couldn't name. Her stomach growled, but she couldn't bring herself to eat, because somewhere in this castle, her grandfather, a man who didn't know she existed, was preparing to dine with her. And somewhere else, a queen who knew exactly who Ilara was planning her death. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and flickering torchlight, so vast that Ilara's footsteps echoed like whispers in a tomb. Long tables stretched the length of the room, but only one was set for dining. A smaller table on a raised platform where the king sat alone, staring into a goblet of wine as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, softened, then hardened again, as if he'd caught himself feeling something he shouldn't. "Come," he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit." Ilara climbed the 3 steps to the platform on legs that felt like water, hyper-aware of the servants standing like statues along the walls, their faces blank but their eyes sharp, watching, always watching. She'd wrapped a strip of cloth around her wrist before leaving Helena's room, tucking it under her sleeve, but now she was terrified it would slip, that someone would see, that the queen would appear from the shadows and point at her with that accusing finger and scream the truth for all to hear. She sat, her back rigid, her hands folded in her lap so tightly her fingers ached. The king studied her in silence, and she felt dissected by that gaze, as if he could see straight through her skin to the blood pumping through her veins. Royal blood, if Lord Dominic was telling the truth. Blood that made her both precious and impossibly dangerous. "You clean up well," the king finally said, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "You look..." He stopped, took a long drink of wine, and set the goblet down with more force than necessary. "You look less like a street child and more like..." Again, he couldn't finish, but Ilara knew what he'd been about to say. More like someone who belonged here. More like Helena. More like family. A servant appeared with a platter of roasted meat, vegetables glazed with honey, bread so fresh that steam rose from it when it was cut. Ilara's stomach cramped with hunger, but she couldn't bring herself to reach for the food. Her hands stayed locked in her lap, trembling slightly. "Eat," the king said, not unkindly. "You're thin as a reed. When did you last have a proper meal?" "I don't remember, Your Majesty." This was true. The days before her mother's disappearance had been a blur of stale bread and watered-down broth, and before that, Alara couldn't separate one hungry day from another. They all bled together into one long ache. The king's jaw tightened, and he pushed the platter closer to her. "Then eat now, please." The please surprised her. Kings didn't say please to street children. They commanded. They ordered. They didn't ask. Slowly, Alara reached for a piece of bread, her movements careful, as if sudden motion might shatter whatever strange spell was holding this moment together. The bread was soft and warm and tasted like heaven, but she could barely swallow past the lump in her throat. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, setting the bread down. "Why are you really doing this? Why did you bring me here?" The king was silent for so long that Alara thought he might not answer. He stared at his plate, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scraped raw. "Because 3 months ago, I lost my daughter, my only child. And every day since, I've walked through this castle like a ghost, surrounded by her things, her memory, her absence. And then today, I saw you in the street, and for one moment, just one insane moment, I thought." He stopped, his hand rising to cover his eyes. "I thought maybe God was giving me a second chance, a chance to save a child, even if I couldn't save my own." The honesty in his words hit Alara like a fist to the chest. This wasn't a king speaking. This was a father, broken and bleeding, trying to piece himself back together with borrowed hope and a stranger's child. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for your loss, for reminding you of her. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," he said sharply, lowering his hand. His eyes were red-rimmed, glassy. "Don't ever apologize for existing, child. You've done nothing wrong. You're just—" He shook his head, as if trying to clear it. "Tell me about your mother. What kind of woman was she?" The question felt like stepping onto ice that might crack at any moment. Alara chose her words carefully, testing each one before speaking. "She was sad, Your Majesty. Always sad, even when she smiled. Like she was carrying something too heavy, but she couldn't put it down. She worked hard, cleaned houses for the merchants' wives. She'd come home with her hands raw and her back bent, but she'd always make sure I ate first, even if it meant she went to bed hungry. She loved you," the king said. And it wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty, I think I was the only thing she did love. Sometimes she'd look at me with this expression that was half joy and half terror, like I was the most precious and most dangerous thing in her world." The king's face had gone pale again, that same bone-white color from when she'd first asked to stay with him. His hand moved to his shoulder, pressing against it through his tunic, and Alara wondered if he was touching the birthmark Lord Dominic had mentioned, the mark that matched hers. "Did she ever speak of your father?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Only to say he was good, that he was brave, that he died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." This was what her mother had always said, the same words repeated like a prayer or a lie told so many times it had calcified into truth. She said I had his eyes. The king's hand, which had been reaching for his wine goblet, froze mid-air. His gaze snapped to Alara's face, studying her eyes with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she forced herself to meet his stare, to let him see whatever he was searching for. "Your eyes," he said slowly, "are very dark, almost black." "Yes, Your Majesty. My mother said it was unusual, that most people in the lower quarter have lighter eyes, brown or hazel, but mine are like mine," the king finished, his voice hollow. "Your eyes are exactly like mine." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alara could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears, could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the cold of the hall. "Say something," she thought desperately. "Say anything to break this terrible moment." But before she could speak, a sound echoed through the hall that made her blood turn to ice. Slow, deliberate clapping. Queen Isabella emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hall, her purple gown whispering against the stone floor as she approached. Her face was a mask of cold amusement, but her eyes burned with something that looked like madness barely contained. "What a touching scene," she said, her voice dripping with venom disguised as honey. The grieving king and the pathetic orphan bonding over bread and tragic tales. How very sentimental. Isabella. The king rose from his chair, his hand moving to the sword that wasn't at his belt. A telling gesture. This is a private meal. You weren't invited. Wasn't I? Isabella climbed the steps to the platform, each movement graceful and predatory. But surely, husband, I should be present when you entertain guests in our home, especially guests who bear such remarkable resemblances to our family. She stopped directly beside Alara's chair, so close that Alara could smell her perfume, something floral and cloying that made her nauseous. Tell me, child, Isabella continued, her hand coming to rest on Alara's shoulder with enough pressure to make her wince. That cloth, wrapped around your wrist, is it covering a wound? Or perhaps something else? Alara's heart stopped, completely stopped. The king took a step forward, his face darkening. Remove your hand from her, Isabella. Now. Or what, Edmund? You'll have me arrested? Thrown in the dungeons? We both know you lack the spine for that. Her fingers dug deeper into Alara's shoulder, and Alara felt the cloth around her wrist beginning to slip, felt the edge of the birthmark beginning to show. I asked you a question, little girl. What are you hiding? Nothing, Your Majesty, Alara managed to say, her voice shaking. I cut myself on broken glass. When I broke the window to escape. It's just a bandage. A bandage, Isabella repeated. And then with a movement so fast Alara didn't see it coming, the queen grabbed her wrist and yanked it upward, ripping the cloth away. The crescent moon birthmark gleamed in the torchlight, dark against pale skin. Unmistakable, undeniable. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. No one breathed. Isabella stared at the mark, her face cycling through emotions so quickly they were almost impossible to track. Shock, recognition, fear, and finally, settling into something that looked like cold, calculated determination. Well, she said softly, releasing Alara's wrist as if it were contaminated. Isn't this interesting? She turned to face the king, and the smile on her face was the most frightening thing Alara had ever seen. It seems, husband, that your one day of charity has brought something far more permanent into our home. Tell me, do you recognize that mark, or shall I refresh your memory? The king's face had gone gray, his eyes locked on Alara's wrist. Isabella, don't. That mark. Isabella spoke over him, her voice rising to fill the entire hall, ensuring every servant, every guard, every listening ear could hear, is the royal birthmark. The mark that appears on every legitimate child of the bloodline. The mark your daughter Helena carried. The mark you carry on your shoulder. And now apparently the mark this little street rat carries as well. She paused, letting the implications sink in like poison into soil. So I'll ask you directly, Edmund, in front of all these witnesses, how exactly does a common child from the lower quarter come to bear the mark of your blood? The king's face had transformed into something carved from granite, every muscle locked, every emotion buried so deep that only his eyes betrayed him. They were wild, darting between Alara's wrist and Isabella's triumphant expression, calculating odds and consequences with the speed of a man watching his entire world collapse. Everyone out, he said, his voice low and deadly. Now. The servants didn't need to be told twice. They melted into the shadows and disappeared through doors that closed with soft clicks, leaving only the 3 of them in the vast hall. The torches seemed to burn lower, as if even the fire wanted to hide from what was coming. Isabella laughed, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Oh no, Edmund, you don't get to hide this anymore. Do you have any idea how long I've searched? How many years I've spent tracking every rumor, every whisper, every mention of a child that might carry your bastard blood? Careful, the king said, his hand finally finding the dagger at his belt, not drawing it but resting his palm on the hilt in clear warning. You're speaking of things you don't understand, don't I? Isabella moved closer. To him, fearless, her chin raised in defiance. Let me tell you what I understand, husband. 15 years ago, before our marriage, you bedded a kitchen maid named Seren. She got pregnant. I found out. And I made sure she understood that if she ever spoke of it, if she ever came back, if she ever tried to claim that child as yours, I would destroy her so completely that not even the worms would remember her name. Her voice had gone cold, flat, the voice of someone recounting facts rather than confessing to threats. I paid her 500 gold crowns to disappear, to marry someone else, to raise that bastard as a commoner's child and never ever come near this castle again. Ilara's head was spinning, Lord Dominic's words echoing through her skull like church bells. Seren was her grandmother, which meant her mother, Mira, was the king's daughter, which meant she was sitting here listening to the woman who had destroyed her family with money and threats. You had no right, the king said, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded exhausted, defeated, as if this was a battle he'd lost years ago and was only now seeing the corpse. I had every right, Isabella shot back. I was your betrothed, your future queen, and I will not, share my throne or my husband's legacy with the spawn of some common whore who spread her legs in the pantry. The words hit Ilara like physical blows, and she found herself standing without remembering the decision to move, her chair scraping backward with a screech that echoed through the hall. "Don't you dare speak about my grandmother that way," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You don't know anything about her, about what she suffered, about what you took from her." Isabella's head snapped toward her, eyes widening in something that might have been respect or might have been rage. "Your grandmother," she repeated slowly. "So you do know. Someone's been talking. Was it Dominic? That withered old fool with his precious records and his insufferable memory?" "It doesn't matter who told her," the king said, stepping between them again. "What matters is that you're confirming everything. You're admitting that you interfered with my life, with my child, with your mistake." Isabella interrupted coldly. "Yes, Edmund, I interfered. I cleaned up your mess. I protected your reputation and your throne, and I'd do it again." She turned her attention back to Ilara, studying her with the clinical interest of someone examining a bug under glass. "So if Seren was your grandmother, that makes your mother the bastard child. What was her name? Where is she now?" Ilara's mouth went dry. She thought of her mother's terrified face, her desperate whispers, the way she'd lock the door and run. "I don't know where she is," Ilara said. And it was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "She left me 3 days ago. She locked me in our room and disappeared." Something flickered across Isabella's face, too quick to identify. "Locked you in and disappeared," she murmured. "How very convenient." "What do you mean?" the king demanded. Isabella waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing. Just that it's curious timing, isn't it? The bastard granddaughter appears on the king's doorstep, just as he's most vulnerable, most grief-stricken, most likely to take in a stray child out of misplaced guilt, almost as if it were planned." "Planned?" Ilara's voice rose despite her fear. "My mother abandoned me. She left me to starve. There was no plan. There was just..." Her voice broke, and she hated herself for it, hated showing weakness in front of this woman who clearly fed on it. "There was just me, alone and scared and hungry, and I didn't know what else to do." The king's expression softened, and he reached toward her before catching himself, his hand falling back to his side. "Isabella, enough. The child has been through enough without your accusations." "The child," Isabella said, with a bitter laugh, "is a threat to everything we've built. Don't you see that, Edmund? She carries the mark, the royal mark. Anyone with eyes can see she has your blood. If the nobles find out, if the people discover you have a living bloodline outside our marriage, they'll question everything. Helena's legitimacy, my position, your entire reign. Then we'll deal with it," the king said, but he sounded uncertain, as if he were trying to convince himself more than Isabella. "We'll find a solution that doesn't involve..." "Doesn't involve what?" Isabella's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Say it, Edmund. doesn't involve making sure this problem disappears the way her grandmother did, the way her mother apparently has. A cold horror washed over Alara as the implication sank in. "What did you do?" she whispered, looking at Isabella with new understanding. "What did you do to my mother?" "I did what was necessary," Isabella said simply. 3 months ago, your mother started asking questions, making inquiries about her real father. Someone, perhaps one of the servants who'd been here since the old days, must have told her something. She came to the castle, tried to gain entry, claimed she had a right to speak with the king. Isabella's smile was pure ice. I had her turned away, of course, but I made a mistake. I didn't have her followed. I didn't ensure she understood the consequences of pursuing this further. And now here we are. Ilara's mind raced, pieces clicking, together with sickening clarity. "The man my mother killed," she said slowly. "The one she was running from. He wasn't my stepfather, was he? He was someone you sent, someone who tried to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horror. "Silence her?" Isabella supplied helpfully. "Yes. Unfortunately, your mother proved more resourceful than anticipated. She fought back, killed my man with his own knife, and then she ran, but not before leaving you behind, hoping the king's soft heart would provide protection she could no longer offer." The king's face had gone from gray to white to a sickly green. "You sent an assassin after her, after my daughter." "I sent a problem solver after a threat," Isabella corrected. "But since we're being so honest tonight, shall I tell you the rest? Shall I tell you about Princess Helena?" The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of dread in every direction. "Don't," the king said, his voice breaking. "Isabella, don't do this." "Why not? The child should know the whole truth, shouldn't she?" Isabella's eyes glittered with malice, or perhaps madness. Ilara could no longer tell the difference. Helena found out about Seren, found out she had a half-sister somewhere in the kingdom. She was furious with both of us, me for covering it up, you for creating the situation. She threatened to announce it publicly, to legitimize the bastard line, to share her inheritance. Isabella paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. She wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't accept that some secrets must stay buried. "So yes, Edmund, since we're confessing our sins tonight, I'll confess mine. The riding accident wasn't an accident. I had the saddle girth weakened. I knew that path, knew that jump, knew exactly what would happen when the leather snapped." The king made a sound like a wounded animal, raw and broken. He staggered backward, his hand clutching at his chest as if his heart were being ripped out through his ribs. "You killed her," he whispered. "You killed my Helena." "I protected the throne," Isabella said, no remorse in her voice, only cold practicality. "I protected us, and I do it again, because that's what queens do, Edmund. We make the hard choices. We cut away the rot before it spreads. And this child—" She turned to face Ilara fully, and the look in her eyes made Ilara's blood turn to ice. "This child is rot. Legacy rot that should have been burned out years ago." Ilara backed away, her legs hitting the chair, nearly tripping. "Your Majesty," she said, looking desperately at the king, "please, I don't want anything. I don't want the throne or recognition or anything. I just want to find my mother. I just want to leave and never come back. Please." But the king wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Isabella with an expression of such profound betrayal, such absolute devastation, that Ilara knew whatever happened next would change everything. "You murdered my daughter," he said again, his voice gaining strength, turning hard as steel. "You murdered Helena, and you would have murdered Mira, and now you stand here threatening Ilara as if you have any right, any authority." "I have every right," Isabella interrupted. "I'm your queen. I'm your wife. And I know things, Edmund. Things about where your loyalties truly lie. Things about decisions you've made that the nobility would find very, very interesting." Her smile turned predatory. "So, here's what's going to happen. The child will leave at first light. She'll be escorted far from the kingdom with enough coin to survive, but she'll sign a document swearing never to return, never to speak of her heritage, never to claim any connection to this family. And in return, she lives. Everyone lives. We continue as we were, and this unfortunate evening becomes nothing more than a regrettable memory. And if I refuse? The king asked quietly. If I refuse to send her away? If I claim her publicly as my granddaughter? As Helena's sister? Isabella's expression didn't change, but something dark moved behind her eyes. Then accidents happen, Edmund. They happen to kings who become unstable. They happen to children who wander where they shouldn't. And they happen to mothers hiding in the lower quarter with blood on their hands and nowhere left to run. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Alara realized with crystal clarity that she was standing at the center of a web that had been woven years before she was born. Threads of lies and murder and secrets that had already claimed too many lives. One day in the castle, that's all she'd asked for. One day to feel safe, to feel wanted, to pretend she mattered. But that day had revealed a truth that made safety impossible and wanting her a death sentence. The king moved so fast that Alara barely saw him cross the distance between himself and Isabella. One moment he was standing frozen in devastation, the next his hand was wrapped around the queen's throat, not squeezing. Not yet. But the threat was clear in every rigid line of his body. "You will not touch her," he said, each word bitten off with surgical precision. "You will not threaten her, and you will certainly not speak of accidents as if they're inevitable weather patterns you can predict and control." Isabella didn't flinch, didn't struggle, didn't show even a flicker of fear. She simply looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes and smiled. "Remove your hand from my throat, husband, or I'll scream. And when the guards come running, I'll tell them you've gone mad with grief, that you attacked me, that you're unfit to rule. And they'll believe me, Edmund, because deep down, you know I'm right. You are unfit. You've been unfit since the moment Helena died." His hand trembled, and for a heartbeat, Alara thought he might actually squeeze, might actually kill this woman who had destroyed so many lives with her ambition and cruelty. But then his fingers opened, and Isabella stepped back, smoothing her gown as if nothing had happened. "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "You don't have the stomach for what needs to be done. You never did. That's why you need me." She turned toward the door, her movements unhurried, confident. "The child leaves at dawn. Have her ready, or I'll have my men ready her. The choice is yours." She paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Edmund, sleep well tonight. It may be the last peaceful sleep you have for a very long time." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. The king stood motionless for several seconds, his back to Alara, his shoulders rising and falling with breaths that sounded painful. When he finally turned, his face was that of a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry you had to hear all of that you had to learn the truth in such a brutal way." Alara felt numb, disconnected from her own body, as if she were watching this scene happen to someone else. "Is it true?" she asked. "All of it? My grandmother was serene. My mother is your daughter. Princess Helena was my—" She couldn't say the word. Aunt felt too intimate, too real. "Yes," the king said simply. "I believe it's all true. The birthmark alone would be evidence enough, but your eyes, your face, the timing of everything." He moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Alara, I need you to understand something I didn't know. About Saren's pregnancy, about the child, about any of it. Isabella handled everything, and I was too much of a coward to ask questions I didn't want answers to." "You abandoned them," Alara said, and she was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You abandoned my grandmother, and then you let your wife pay her to disappear, and my mother grew up thinking she was worthless, thinking she was a mistake that had to be hidden." "Yes," the king said again, not making excuses, not defending himself. "I did all of those things. Through action or inaction, I destroyed your family. And now Isabella has made it very clear that the only way to keep you alive is to send you away, to make you disappear just like your grandmother did. He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 42 years. So that's what I should do, what any reasonable king would do. Protect the throne, maintain stability, sacrifice one child to save thousands. The way he said it made Alara's stomach clench. But you're not going to do that, she said slowly, reading something in his expression that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Are you? The king looked up at her, and his eyes were no longer the eyes of a defeated man. They were the eyes of someone who had finally, after months of drowning in grief, found something solid to grab onto, even if that something was rage. No, he said, quietly. I'm not going to do that. I've spent 3 months being a ghost in my own castle, letting Isabella run everything while I wallowed in loss. I've been weak, pathetic, but I won't be weak anymore. He stood, straightening to his full height, and suddenly he looked every inch the king he was supposed to be. Isabella murdered Helena. She attempted to murder your mother, and she's threatening to murder you. Those aren't the actions of a queen protecting her throne. Those are the actions of a criminal who's gotten away with too much for too long. What are you going to do? Alara whispered. I'm going to do what I should have done months ago, the king said. I'm going to call a council, present the evidence, strip Isabella of her title and her power, and I'm going to claim you, publicly and officially, as my granddaughter and rightful member of this bloodline. The words should have filled Alara with joy, or at least relief, but instead they filled her with dread so thick she could taste it. She'll kill us both, she said. You heard her. She has plans, contingencies, people loyal to her. Probably. The king agreed. But what's the alternative? Send you away to live in fear. Hope Isabella's assassins don't find you in 6 months or 6 years. Watch you disappear the way Serene did, the way your mother has. He moved to stand directly in front of her, and for the first time he reached out and placed both hands on her shoulders. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. I failed your grandmother. I failed your mother. I failed Helena. But I will not fail you, Alara, not even if keeping that promise costs me everything. Tears burned in Alara's eyes, hot and unwelcome. I don't want you to die for me. I don't want anyone else to die because of me. Then we'd better make sure no one does, a voice said from the shadows. Both of them spun toward the sound, the king's hand flying to his dagger. Lord Dominic emerged from behind one of the massive pillars that lined the hall, his dark robes blending with the darkness so completely he might have been made of shadow himself. How long have you been there? The king demanded. Long enough, Dominic said, approaching them with measured steps. Long enough to hear Queen Isabella's confession, long enough to witness her threats, and long enough to realize that we have a very narrow window to act before she consolidates her power and makes any opposition impossible. He stopped a few paces away, his eyes moving between the king and Alara with an expression that might have been approval or might have been calculation. Your Majesty, if you're truly committed to this course of action, to claiming the child and exposing the queen, then you need to understand what you're actually facing. Isabella doesn't just have plans and contingencies. She has the loyalty of at least half the royal guard, 3 of the 5 High Council members, and enough dirt on the remaining nobles to keep them silent even if they disagree with her. How do you know all of this? The king asked, but he didn't sound surprised, only tired. Because I've been documenting it for years, Dominic said simply. Every bribe, every threat, every questionable decision. I keep records, Your Majesty. It's what I do. It's what I've always done. He pulled a thick leather portfolio from within his robes, the same portfolio he'd shown Alara earlier. In here is everything. Proof of the payment to Serene. Testimony from servants who witnessed Isabella's meetings with the man who tried to kill Mira. And most importantly, he paused, his expression grave. A letter, written by Princess Helena 2 days before her death, detailing everything she'd discovered about her half-sister, and her suspicions about her stepmother's involvement in keeping that information hidden. The king's breath caught. Helena knew. She wrote it down. She was intelligent, Dominic said. She knew she was in danger, so she wrote everything out and gave it to me for safekeeping, made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would find a way to make the truth known. I've been waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst. His eyes moved to Ilara, and now she's here. Ilara felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like chains. So what happens now? She asked, her voice small. Now, Dominic said, we prepare for war, not with swords and armies, but with words and evidence and political maneuvering. We call an emergency council meeting for tomorrow morning, before Isabella has time to prepare her defenses. We present everything, all at once, overwhelming the nobles with truth before they can decide which lie to believe. They'll never accept it, the king said, but there was hope in his voice now, dangerous and desperate. They'll say we forged the documents, that we're trying to destabilize the throne. Some will, Dominic agreed, but not all. And the ones who do accept it will be enough. Enough to force Isabella to answer for her crimes. Enough to protect Ilara. Enough to... He hesitated, then continued quietly. Enough to give Helena the justice she deserved. The three of them stood in silence, the enormity of what they were planning settling over them like a shroud. This wasn't just about exposing a murderess. This was about tearing down everything the kingdom had believed for years, revealing that their queen was a monster, and their late princess a victim of the very system meant to protect her. There's one problem, Ilara said, surprised by her own courage in speaking up. My mother. Isabella said she knows where she is, or at least that she has people looking for her. If we move against the queen, won't she? She couldn't finish, but they all knew what she meant. Won't Isabella kill her mother in retaliation? The king and Dominic exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. We need to find Mira first, the king said. Before the council meeting, before Isabella realizes what we're planning. I know where she might be, Ilara said suddenly, a memory surfacing. Before we lived in the room where she left me, we stayed with an old woman, a healer named Marguerite in the Eastern Quarter. My mother called her aunt, but I don't think they were actually related. She was just kind to us. Then that's where we start, Dominic said decisively. I'll send men I trust, men who aren't in Isabella's pocket. They'll find Mira and bring her here, under guard, before dawn. And if they can't find her? Ilara asked, voicing the fear that was clawing at her insides. If she's already, then we proceed anyway, the king said grimly. We can't let Isabella's crimes go unpunished because we're afraid of what she might do. That's exactly how she's maintained power for so long, by making everyone too terrified to act against her. He looked down at Ilara, and she saw steel in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Tonight you sleep in Helena's room. My guards, the ones I know are loyal, will stand watch outside your door. Tomorrow we change everything. We tell the truth, no matter the cost. And we pray that truth is enough to save us all. But even as he said it, even as Dominic nodded in agreement and began making plans for the morning, Ilara felt a cold certainty settling in her bones. Isabella wasn't the kind of woman who waited for council meetings and official accusations. She was the kind of woman who struck first, struck hard, and asked forgiveness never. Somewhere in this castle, in the darkness beyond the torchlight, the queen was already making her own plans. And those plans, Ilara knew with absolute conviction, involved making sure the sun never rose on a world where anyone could challenge her power. The only question was whether they would see the knife coming before it struck. Ilara couldn't sleep. She lay in Princess Helena's bed, surrounded by silk pillows and blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and dust, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the candlelight. Every creak of the castle settling made her heart jump. Every distant footstep made her imagine Isabella's assassins creeping closer. The two guards outside her door were supposed to make her feel safe, but instead they just reminded her how much danger she was in. People didn't post armed guards outside the rooms of children who weren't in mortal peril. She thought about her mother, somewhere out in the darkness, hiding, running. Did she know that Alara was here, in the castle, sleeping in a dead princess's bed? Did she know that the secret she'd spent her whole life protecting was about to be screamed from the rooftops? Or was she already dead? Another casualty of Isabella's ruthless efficiency? The thought made Alara's stomach twist so violently she had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from being sick. She sat up, pushing the blankets away, suddenly feeling suffocated by their weight. The room was too quiet, too still, like a museum dedicated to a ghost. She slid out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, and moved to the window. The glass was thick and warped with age, distorting the view of the courtyard below. But she could still make out shapes moving in the darkness. Guards on their rounds, servants carrying torches. Normal castle activity. Except nothing about tonight was normal. A soft scraping sound from behind her made every muscle in her body lock. She turned slowly, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and saw one of the dolls on the window seat had fallen over. Just a doll. Just gravity and an unstable base. Nothing sinister. But her hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding her system with nowhere to go. "You're being paranoid," she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, she knew paranoia was the only sensible response to a woman who'd murdered her own stepdaughter and was now hunting Alara's entire family line. She was about to climb back into bed when she heard voices in the corridor. Low, urgent, male. Not the guards who were supposed to be standing watch. Their voices she would have recognized. These were different, unfamiliar. Her breath caught. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood, straining to hear. "Told us to be quick about it," one voice was saying. "In and out before anyone notices she's gone." "What about the guards?" Another voice asked, younger, uncertain. "Already taken care of," the first voice said, and there was something in his tone that made Alara's blood turn to ice. "They won't be a problem. Taken care of." The guards were dead. Isabella had sent assassins, just as Alara had known she would, and they were right outside her door. Panic crashed over her in waves, making her thoughts scatter like startled birds. She looked around the room desperately, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon, any way to defend herself. But what could an 8-year-old girl do against trained killers? The door handle began to turn, slowly, carefully, and Alara realized she was out of time. She did the only thing she could think of. She ran to the wardrobe, pulled open the doors as quietly as possible, and climbed inside, burying herself in the mass of Helena's dresses. The fabric was thick and heavy, smelling of cedar and something floral, and she pulled it around herself like armor, making herself as small as possible. Through the crack in the wardrobe doors, she watched her room door open. 2 men entered, both wearing the dark uniforms of castle guards, but something about the way they moved was wrong. Too purposeful, too predatory. These weren't men protecting the castle. They were men violating it. "She's not in bed," the younger one said, confusion clear in his voice. "Check everywhere," the older one ordered. "Under the bed, behind the curtains. She's a child. She can't have gone far." Alara held her breath as they searched, watching through the narrow opening as they tore apart the room with ruthless efficiency. They overturned furniture, ripped blankets from the bed, checked behind every piece of art on the walls, and with each passing second, they were getting closer to the wardrobe. Her heart was beating so loud she was certain they could hear it, a drum announcing her location. The younger man moved toward the wardrobe, his hand reaching for the door, and Alara pressed herself back as far as she could go, feeling the solid wood of the wardrobe's back wall against her spine. This was it. She was going to die in a closet, surrounded by a dead girl's dresses, and her mother would never know what happened to her. The wardrobe door began to open. And then, a voice from the doorway made everyone freeze. "Looking for something, gentlemen?" Lord Dominic stood framed in the entrance, his thin frame somehow managing to project authority despite his lack of physical presence. Behind him stood 4 guards, real guards this time, with swords already drawn. The 2 assassins spun toward him, hands flying to their weapons, but Dominic raised one finger in warning. "I wouldn't," he said mildly. "You're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and most importantly, you've just confirmed every suspicion I had about Queen Isabella's intentions." His eyes were hard as flint behind his spectacles. "Arrest them, and someone check on the guards who were supposed to be stationed here." The younger assassin's face crumpled. "We didn't kill them," he blurted out, his voice high with panic. "Just drugged them. Put sleeping powder in their wine. They'll wake up with headaches, but they'll be fine, I swear. We were just supposed to take the girl, not hurt anyone, not—" "Silence," the older one hissed, but it was too late. The damage was done. Dominic's guards moved forward, disarming and restraining the 2 men with practiced efficiency. Only when they were bound and being led away did Dominic turn his attention to the wardrobe. "You can come out now, child," he said gently. "They're gone. You're safe." Ilara pushed open the wardrobe doors and stumbled out, her legs barely able to hold her weight. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and when Dominic reached out to steady her, she flinched before forcing herself to accept his touch. "How did you know?" she managed to ask. "I didn't sleep either," Dominic said. "I was in my study, going over the documents for tomorrow's council meeting, when I realized something. Isabella is not a woman who waits. She acts. So I sent men to check on you, and we arrived just in time to hear these 2 discussing their orders." He looked down at her with something that might have been respect. "You're cleverer than you look hiding in the wardrobe. Most children would have tried to run or fight. You did neither. You survived. For now," Ilara said, her voice hollow. "But she'll try again, won't she? As long as I'm alive, as long as I can testify about who I am and what she's done, she'll keep trying." "Yes," Dominic said, not sugarcoating it. "She will, which is why we need to move up our timeline. The council meeting can't wait until morning. It needs to happen now, tonight, while we have these men in custody and their confession fresh." "In the middle of the night?" "The middle of the night is when truth comes out," Dominic said. "When people are tired and their defenses are down and lies are harder to maintain. Besides," his expression darkened, "I have news. About your mother." Ilara's heart stuttered. "Is she alive?" Dominic said quickly, seeing the terror in her eyes. "My men found her at the healer's house, just where you said she'd be. She's being brought to the castle now under heavy guard. She should arrive within the hour." Relief flooded through Ilara so powerfully she thought she might collapse. "She's alive. She's really alive." "She is," Dominic confirmed, though she's terrified, understandably. "Apparently she's been hiding since the night she killed Isabella's assassin, moving from place to place, trying to stay ahead of the search. When my men found her, she nearly killed one of them with a kitchen knife before they could explain they were there to help." A fierce pride swelled in Ilara's chest. Her mother was a fighter, a survivor, just like her grandmother had been, just like she was trying to be. "I want to see her," Ilara said. "As soon as she arrives. Please, I need to know she's really okay." "You will," Dominic promised. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safer than this room. Somewhere Isabella's people won't think to look." He gestured toward the door. "Come. The king is waiting. He's been—" Dominic paused, searching for the right word. Transformed is perhaps too strong, but he's certainly not the broken man he was this morning. Knowing he has family still alive, knowing he has a chance to make things right, it's given him purpose again. They left Helena's room and moved through corridors Ilara didn't recognize, taking servants' passages and back staircases that wound through the castle's hidden arteries. Twice they passed other guards, but Dominic's presence ensured no one questioned their passage. Finally, they arrived at a small door hidden behind a tapestry. Dominic pushed it open to reveal a room that was clearly the king's private study. Edmund was there, along with 3 men Ilara didn't recognize, all of them bent over a large table, covered in documents and maps. When the door opened, all 4 men looked up, and the king's face transformed when he saw Alara. "Thank God," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 long strides and dropping to one knee so he was at her eye level. "Dominic sent word about the assassins. I should have anticipated, should have protected you better. I'm fine," Alara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I hid. Lord Dominic found me, and now we're here." She looked at the other men, then back at the king. "What happens now?" The king stood, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that was becoming familiar, protective, paternal. "Now," he said, "we wake the council, we drag them from their beds if we have to, and we end this. Tonight, before Isabella can make another move." One of the other men, an older noble with gray beard and calculating eyes, spoke up. "Your Majesty, with respect, calling an emergency council in the middle of the night will look like desperation. It will make them question your stability before we even present the evidence." "Let them question," the king said flatly. "I'd rather be thought desperate than bury another child because I waited for a more convenient time to pursue justice." The room fell silent at that, the weight of his words settling over them like snow. Finally, the gray-bearded man nodded. "Then let's do this properly. Let's do this right. And let's make sure that when the sun rises tomorrow, it rises on a kingdom that knows the truth, no matter how ugly that truth might be." But even as they began making plans, even as messengers were dispatched to wake the council members and bring them to the throne room, Alara felt a gnawing certainty in her gut. Isabella wasn't just going to sit back and let them destroy her. She was planning something desperate and terrible, and whatever it was, they were running out of time to stop it. The throne room had never been designed for the kind of reckoning that was about to take place within its walls. Torches blazed in their sconces, casting dancing shadows across faces that ranged from confused to angry to calculating. The 5 council members sat in their ornate chairs, hastily dressed, their sleep-heavy eyes sharpening as they took in the scene before them. King Edmund stood before his throne rather than sitting on it, and that alone told them this was not a normal gathering. Lord Dominic stood to his right, that damning leather portfolio clutched in his hands, and to the king's left, barely visible in the shadows but undeniably present, stood a small girl with dark eyes that reflected the torchlight like black mirrors. Alara had never felt so exposed, so scrutinized, so utterly terrified in her entire 8 years of life. The council members whispered among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of speculation that filled the cavernous space. But it was the figure standing at the very back of the throne room that drew Alara's attention and held it with magnetic force. Queen Isabella, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that made her look like a beautiful shadow, stood perfectly still, her face a mask of serene composure. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were fixed on Alara with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "Your Majesty," one of the council members, Lord Garrett, spoke up, his jowls quivering with indignation. "It's past midnight. We were dragged from our beds by your guards, with no explanation beyond emergency council meeting. What could possibly warrant such dramatic murder?" the king said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "Conspiracy, treason, and the systematic destruction of my bloodline." The silence that followed was so complete that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Lord Garrett's face had gone pale. "Your Majesty, those are extremely serious accusations. Against whom are you?" "Against me, obviously." Isabella's voice rang out from the back of the room, and she began walking forward, her steps measured and deliberate. Every eye turned to watch her approach, and Alara noticed how the queen commanded attention without even trying. It was a kind of power that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with absolute certainty in one's own authority. "My husband has apparently decided that his grief has festered into paranoia, and now he sees conspiracies in every shadow." She reached the center of the room and executed a perfect curtsy, the gesture both respectful and mocking simultaneously. "So please, Edmund, enlighten us. What exactly am I supposed to have done?" The king's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice remained steady. 15 years ago, before our marriage, I had a relationship with a woman named Seren who worked in the castle kitchens. She became pregnant. You discovered this and took it upon yourself to pay her to disappear, to marry someone else, to raise that child in secret and never speak of her royal heritage. "A kindness," Isabella said smoothly, addressing the council rather than the king. "I protected the kingdom from scandal. I protected Edmund's reputation, and I ensured that an illegitimate child wouldn't complicate the succession. These are the actions of a devoted wife and queen, not a criminal." "Except the story doesn't end there," Lord Dominic interjected, stepping forward with his portfolio. "That child grew up to become a woman named Mira. And 3 months ago, Mira began asking questions about her real father. She came to the castle seeking answers. He opened the portfolio and withdrew a document. This is a record of payment made to a man named Garrett the Blade, a known assassin, on the same day Mira appeared at the castle gates. The payment was authorized by Queen Isabella." A collective gasp rippled through the council. Isabella's expression didn't change, but Alara saw her hands clench into fists. At her sides, a tiny crack in her perfect composure. "That proves nothing," Isabella said. "I make many payments on behalf of the crown, without context. The context," Dominic continued relentlessly, "is that Garrett the Blade was found dead in Mira's lodgings 3 days ago, killed with his own knife in what Mira claims was self-defense when he attempted to murder her." He pulled out another document. "We have Garrett's body in the castle morgue. We have the knife, and we have 2 of your personal guards who were just caught attempting to kidnap this child from her room tonight." He gestured toward Alara. "A child who bears the royal birthmark and who is, by all evidence, your husband's granddaughter." The room erupted, council members shouting questions. Isabella's face finally showing genuine emotion, a flash of rage so pure it was almost beautiful in its intensity. And through it all, the king stood silent, letting the chaos wash over him, letting the truth do its terrible work. Finally, he raised his hand, and slowly, reluctantly, the room quieted. "There's more," he said, and his voice was heavy with a grief so profound it seemed to age him as he spoke. "Princess Helena, my daughter. Her death 3 months ago was no accident." "No," Lord Garrett breathed, his hand rising to his chest as if to ward off a physical blow. "Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," the king said. "I'm stating a fact. Helena discovered the truth about her half-sister. She confronted Isabella about it. She threatened to make the information public, to legitimize Mira's claim to royal blood. And 2 days later, her saddle girth mysteriously weakened during her morning ride, causing her to fall and strike her head on a rock. Instantly, conveniently, permanently fatal." He turned to look directly at Isabella, and the expression on his face was that of a man staring at a monster wearing the skin of someone he'd once loved. "Tell me I'm wrong, Isabella. Tell me you didn't kill my daughter. Tell me you didn't rob me of the only family I had left, all to protect a secret that was never yours to keep." Isabella stared back at him, and for a long moment, Alara thought she might actually confess, might break down and admit everything. But then the queen's lips curved into a smile that was all sharp edges and calculated cruelty. "You want the truth, Edmund? Fine, I'll give you the truth." She turned to address the entire council, her voice rising to fill every corner of the throne room. "Yes, I paid Seren to disappear. Yes, I sent men after Mira when she became a threat. And yes, I arranged Helena's accident because she was too naive, too idealistic, too stupid to understand that some secrets must stay buried for the good of the kingdom." The confession hit like a thunderbolt, stunning everyone into silence. But Isabella wasn't finished. "Everything I did to protect this throne, to protect the stability you all take for granted. Do you think the nobility would have accepted a king with bastard blood running through half the royal line? Do you think the people would have trusted a succession muddied by common-born children with dubious claims? She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I saved this kingdom from tearing itself apart. I made the hard choices that Edmund was too weak to make, and I would do it all again. Then you leave me no choice, the king said quietly. He turned to the captain of the guard, who had been standing silent witness throughout. Arrest Queen Isabella on charges of conspiracy, attempted murder, and regicide. Strip her of her title and her authority. She will stand trial before the full council within the week. The guards moved forward, but Isabella didn't try to run or fight. She simply stood there, that terrible smile still on her face, as they bound her wrists. You think this changes anything? She said, her eyes finding Alara's across the room. You think you've won because you've exposed me? You're a fool, Edmund. I'm not the only one who sees that child as a threat. The moment you officially recognize her, the moment you legitimize her claim to royal blood, you paint a target on her back that will never fade. Every noble with ambitions for the throne, every merchant hoping to curry favor, every enemy of the crown will see her as a weakness to exploit. You've just guaranteed that she'll spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the knife. Before the king could respond, before anyone could process what Isabella had said, the throne room doors burst open. Guards entered, and between them, supported because her legs could barely hold her, was a woman Alara recognized even though she looked like a ghost of herself. Mama! The word tore from Alara's throat without permission, and she was running before anyone could stop her, crossing the distance between them in seconds and throwing herself into her mother's arms. Mira collapsed to her knees, pulling Alara close, and they clung to each other like drowning people finding solid ground. I'm sorry. Mira sobbed into Alara's hair, her whole body shaking. I'm so sorry I left you. I thought if I ran, if I led them away, you'd be safe. I know, Alara whispered, tears streaming down her own face. I know, Mama. It's okay. We're together now. We're safe. But even as she said it, even as she held her mother and felt the rapid beating of her heart, Alara knew it wasn't true. Isabella's words echoed in her mind with the ring of prophecy. They would never be safe. Not really. Not ever. The king approached them slowly, and when Mira looked up and saw him, her face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Recognition, disbelief, anger, and finally settling into something that looked like exhausted resignation. Father, she said, the word foreign on her tongue, as if she'd never spoken it before. Because she hadn't. Not to him, not ever. Mira, he replied, and his voice broke on her name. My daughter, I'm so sorry for everything, for not knowing, for not protecting you, for allowing Isabella to... He stopped, unable to continue. Mira stood on shaking legs, still holding Alara close, and faced the man who was her father, the king who had never known she existed. I don't forgive you, she said bluntly. I don't know if I ever can. But, she looked down at Alara, then back at him. But I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. So if you're offering protection, if you're offering legitimacy, if you're offering a chance for my daughter to grow up without constantly looking over her shoulder, she took a deep breath. Then I'll accept. For her sake, if not for mine. The king nodded, understanding written in every line of his face. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't a happy family reunion. This was a negotiation, a truce between damaged people trying to survive in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. Lord Dominic stepped forward, ever practical. Your Majesty, we should formalize this. Draft the documents. Make the announcement before rumors spread. And we need to decide what to do about... He glanced toward Isabella, who was being led away by guards, her head held high even in defeat. About the trial and its implications. Tomorrow, the king said wearily. We'll deal with all of it tomorrow. Tonight I just want... He looked at Mira and Alara, his family. The family he'd never known he had until it was almost too late. Tonight I just want to make sure you're both safe, comfortable, that you have everything you need. We need rest, Mira said simply, and time, and probably guards, because Isabella was right about one thing. There will be others who see us as threats or opportunities. This isn't over. No, the king agreed. It's not over. But it's a beginning, and perhaps. He reached out tentatively, and after a moment's hesitation, Mira allowed him to take her hand. Perhaps that's enough for now. As dawn began to break over the castle, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Elara stood at the window of a new room, one that had been prepared hastily but comfortably. Her mother slept in the bed behind her, exhausted beyond measure, finally allowing herself to rest, because for the first time in days, armed guards stood watch outside their door. Guards who were loyal to the king, who would protect them. Elara pressed her hand against the cool glass and looked down at her wrist, at the crescent moon birthmark that had changed everything. She thought about Princess Helena, the aunt she'd never met, who had died for knowing the truth. She thought about her grandmother Seren, who had been paid to disappear and had spent her whole life hiding. And she thought about her mother, who had killed a man to protect them both and would carry that weight forever. They had survived. Against all odds, against Isabella's schemes and assassins and lies, they had survived. But survival wasn't the same as safety. Survival wasn't the same as happiness. Survival was just continuing, one day at a time. Behind her, her mother stirred in sleep, murmuring something that might have been Elara's name or might have been a prayer. Elara turned from the window and climbed into bed beside her, curling into her side the way she had when she was smaller, when the world had been simpler and the only danger was going to bed hungry. "I asked for one day," Elara whispered into the darkness. "One day with the king, one day to feel safe. And instead, I got everything. A family, a title, a future." She closed her eyes, feeling her mother's heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. I hope it was worth it. But deep in the castle's dungeons, locked behind iron bars, Isabella sat in perfect stillness and smiled into the darkness. Because she knew something they didn't. Something she'd learned long ago in her climb to power. Truth might set you free, but it also made you visible. And visible things were so very, very easy to destroy. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help when we have nothing left to lose. Elara walked into that castle as a starving orphan and walked out as royalty, but the real transformation wasn't in her title or her bloodline. It was in her courage to survive when survival seemed impossible, to trust when trust had been shattered, and to hope when hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her story forces us to ask ourselves the hardest questions. Would you have had the strength to hide in that wardrobe while assassins searched for you? Could you forgive a grandfather who abandoned your family? Or a mother who locked you away to save your life? And most importantly, when the truth costs everything, is it still worth telling? This tale reminds us that family isn't just about blood. It's about the battles we're willing to fight for each other. That justice isn't always clean or simple, and sometimes the people we love carry secrets so heavy they can barely breathe. Queen Isabella was right about one thing. The truth does make us visible, vulnerable, targets for those who profit from lies. But she was wrong about everything else. Because Elara didn't just survive. She reclaimed her name, her heritage, and her right to exist without apology. And that, more than any crown or castle, is what true royalty looks like. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button, follow for more stories that will make you think and feel, and remember, we all have a little bit of Elara in us, waiting for the courage to step forward and demand the life we deserve, even when the whole world says we're not enough.